Hello, and welcome to our webinar, Middle Grade Fantasy, Explore Our Worlds. I'm Julia Smith, Senior Editor, Books for Youth at Booklist. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some technical details. The audience is in listen-only mode, but we welcome any questions you may have. On the bottom of your screen is a toolbar with a section for Q&A. If you have a question or need technical assistance, simply click Q&A and type your message into the box that appears. We will do our best to respond to all tech-related questions, and we'll pass along all other questions to today's panelists so they can follow up with you after the webinar. Links to today's slides and title list were included in the reminder email you received from Zoom 1 hour ago. To download them, please open that email, scroll to the bottom, and click on those links that are located there. You can also download these materials at any time by copying the URLs on this screen into your web browser. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from Brandon Mull, author of the Fablehaven and Dragonwatch series, J. Scott Savage, author of the Lost Wonderland Diaries and Mysteries of Cove series, and Ilise Levine, Director of Sales and Marketing at Shadow Mountain Publishing. All right, let's get started with the program. Brandon Mull is the author of several best-selling series, including Fablehaven, Beyonders, Five Kingdoms, and Dragonwatch. He's worked as a comedian, filing clerk, and a copywriter before becoming a full-time writer. He and his family have a big dog named Buffy. J. Scott Savage, who is the author of Mysteries of Cove series and 17 other novels, has visited more than 1,400 schools and taught dozens of writing classes. He has 4 children, 5 grandchildren, and lives with his wife, Jennifer, in a windy valley of the Rocky Mountains. We'll begin by hearing from Brandon. Welcome, Brandon. The floor is yours.
Great, thanks. Hello, I am happy to be here with you guys today. So I have been cooped up, probably like a lot of you guys. And it's sometimes that's hard because in my job as a writer, it's already kind of a solitary job. I spend a lot of my time alone in a room typing. And what sort of offsets that is that sometimes I go on book tour and I get to be around other people. And with COVID, that is kind of making all my book tour stuff, whatever's left of it has gone kind of virtual and on the computer. So man, it's like an introvert's paradise, but it sometimes makes me get, like, I don't want to totally give into my introvert side, or like I would never return and get a big beard full of owls. I think I miss spending time with librarians. Librarians are a lot like me in that their job kind of has a public side and a private side. There's parts of being a librarian, I think, where you can get into the cataloging and the book acquisition side, and some of it feels kind of private. And then it's so very public as you interact with patrons. And a little bit, it's like that for me. Like I have a private side when I'm creating the book, and that part's so intensely private. And then when I share the book, it becomes so intensely public. It's kind of like going from the hot tub into the pool. There's sort of a shock to it. My latest series is called Dragonwatch, and maybe go to the next slide. Partly to help me not go crazy as I am in isolation. At least I have some kids. I have a family. That is my daughter Sadie, my son Chase, my daughter Rose, and my son Calvin. And those are the 4 kids that I had up until about 5 years ago. And then maybe go to the next slide. We all like nerdy stuff and fantasy stuff. That's from Halloween, all the kids dressed up on the Avatar theme. I loved that Calvin made a good Aang, and that picture is one of my favorite pictures. You can go to the next slide. Sadie and Rose, also on the Avatar theme. Go to the next slide. Sadie and Rose and Chase. So my son Chase, who you just saw better in the previous slide, this is him when he was a little younger. And I like this picture of him because it helps define who he is a little bit. He is a little bit like my character Seth. Now, I wrote Seth before Chase existed, but Seth is the main boy in Fablehaven. And Seth is a recklessly curious kid. He is the kind of kid who, if you leave him alone in a room with a beehive, when you came back, he would be wearing the beehive. He is the kind of kid who can make the same mistake in 10 different ways and still kind of not fully learn the lesson. And part of what I like about Seth is that he's sincere. He's got a good heart. He's not trying to do bad things just to do bad things, but his curiosity can sometimes lead him into all sorts of mischief that keep the story interesting, and also for me make him relatable because I have a brother like him and a son like him. In this picture, Chase decided he wanted to try to chimney up between the roof and the tree to get to that little branch. Then when he got to the branch, he wasn't sure what to do with himself because the drop was onto an angled roof, which would have hurt his ankle. He was with my brother Bryson at the time, which means instead of help getting down, he got a picture taken of him. But he did eventually get down. We can go to the next slide. This is my son, Calvin. And I like this slide because it's not your typical slide. Not your typical picture that you would share. We were at a soccer game, a rainy soccer game, and his game got rained out and he was all bummed out. And I feel like I caught a picture of him with with genuine emotion, like some genuine sadness. And it reminds me of something that an illustrator named David Small shared with me. I was at a book conference and David Small was thumbing through picture books. And he was thumbing through them for like an hour. Like I kind of had noticed him several times, like just over there at the picture books, thumbing through. So I came up to him and said, "Hey, what are you looking for as you thumb through all these books?" And he was like, I'm looking for life. And to me, that was like a Yoda-like answer, like maybe too deep for me to understand, like at first. And so I persisted and said, what do you mean you're looking for life? And he showed me in the book he was looking at, and he said, well, look at this painter, for example. And it was like a house painter. And the house painter was leaning to reach a spot, leaning out with his brush. And as he was leaning out, his trousers were kind of drooping. And so with one hand, he's trying to keep his trousers up. With the other, he's reaching with the paintbrush. And he's like, see how this guy is kind of trying to keep his trousers up as he leans? He goes, that's the kind of human detail that puts life into the picture for me. And I was like, oh, like you're looking for life, in that you're looking for like illustrations with some great human details captured, right? Maybe not the kind of thing that you would pose for, but the kind of thing that you would capture if you managed to take a snapshot of a real moment of a real person. And it's funny, the things that help define your thinking, but for me, it helped define my thinking on what we're trying to do as artists. I think a big part of what we're trying to do as writers and visual artists and all sorts of artists is we are trying to capture a little bit of life. I'm trying to figure out as a writer, how do I put some life into this book so that when someone reads it, the characters feel alive, that there's human details we can relate to. And that is the reason I like that picture of Calvin. I feel like it captures some actual life. It captures an actual moment or a true feeling. Go ahead and go to the next slide. This might be my favorite of all my family pictures ever produced. This was created by Brandon Dorman, who is the illustrator for my Fablehaven and Dragonwatch books, and he did this for me kind of as a gift. It probably is the most honest family photo that we have, not only because someone finally showed my muscles as they really are, but because my life has always been like, ever since I've had kids, it's been a mix of make-believe and real life. There's some very adult real life things about being a dad. And then but I spend my life making up stories and fantasy stories. And this kind of captures that. Kind of rough for me, kind of sad for me. About 5 years ago, I went through a divorce with my wife. And so that wife on the centaur is no longer my wife, which for me was pretty heartbreaking and one of those tough things you go through in life. And when something hard happens, we do our best to keep going. And so you can go ahead and go to the next slide. And so probably about 3 years after my divorce, I met somebody wonderful. Her name is Erlyn. We are starting a new adventure together and it really is quite an adventure. We got married during COVID. We got married just a few months ago. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. And you can know I sincerely like her and sincerely love her because she has 7 kids. And you don't marry a woman with 7 kids on a whim. And so go ahead and go to the next slide. And so now I am the dad of a very big, very busy family, 7 stepkids and 4 kids. I have a good relationship with my ex-wife. She just lives about 5 minutes away. So we share, co-parent our kids. And my new wife, Lynn, she co-parents also with her kids. So our house is a very strange house. It's like Grand Central Station. Part of the week, it is sometimes nobody's here. Sometimes just 4 kids are here, or sometimes her kids are here, or sometimes the whole tribe's here. And when everybody's here, it's like a biblical-sized family, like Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat or something. Like lots of tribes, lots of siblings. And I'm really lucky to have it because there was a season there where my house felt very empty, and now it brought a lot of life back into my home, and I'm grateful for that. You can go ahead and go forward to the next slide. So I'm the author of a bunch of books, and hopefully they're all popping up for you. I wrote the Fablehaven series, was my first published series. Candy Shop War has 2 books in it. Pingo Picture Books. The Beyonder series is 3 books long, maybe my mightiest finale. I created the Spirit Animals series for Scholastic. I wrote book 1 and wrote the outline for that first series, created the story world for that series. I wrote the 5 Kingdoms series, which is a 5-book series about kids who get kidnapped into another world. Some of my very best world building is in that series. And then I think if you click, some more stuff will pop up, like click next. And then Dragonwatch is my sequel series to Fablehaven. So my same main characters as Fablehaven, Kendra and Seth, on a bunch of new adventures. And you can click again. Dragonwatch book 1 and book 2 are already out. That is a flying bunny on the cover of book 2. I mean, what more could you ask for? Book 3 is Master of the Phantom Isle. That was the most recent of my Dragonwatch books, and 4 is releasing right now. We'll have some pictures of that in a minute. But I'm very proud of the books I've written. If you went to me as a 10-year-old boy and showed me the book covers like Master of the Phantom Isle, and said, someday you will write books with these covers, I would have known that everything was going to be okay, that my life was going to be everything I wanted it to be. Because I really did live in my head a lot as a little boy. Go ahead and go to the next slide. That is Dragonwatch book 4. That's my newest release. The Dragonwatch series really does feel like Fablehaven 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I will tell you a little bit more about the series before we're done today. But first, I want to talk a little bit about what got me into fantasy in the first place. So maybe go ahead and page forward, go to the next one. Oh, and I do picture books. My most recent picture book is called Smarter Than a Monster, a survival guide to the monsters you might imagine around your house. My kids like it. It's kind of funny. And I partly write my picture book so I have stuff to share with my younger kids. Go ahead and page forward again. But why do I write fantasy stories? This is a fair question. I am a 45-year-old man, and I write stories about fairies, right? My dad taught me to play baseball, and to some degree, I think I was worried I would shame my father by loving fantasy stories. But actually, I think my dad's ended up being pretty proud of me that I share stories with lots of people and help get kids reading, and he feels good about that, and I certainly feel good about that. I feel like what I wanted to do as a little boy has been realized with what I'm doing as an adult. Go ahead and page forward. For me, my love of fantasy began with a lion. So when I was younger, I didn't love to read that much. And when I say I didn't love to read, if my parents read me a picture book, hey, that was great. I was so happy to do that. But as I got older and it was time for me to read my own chapter books, that didn't seem very attractive to me. There weren't pictures. It seemed kind of felt like a lot of work. It seemed more fun to go outside and ride my bike, or maybe hop the fence and go see what the neighbors are up to. But like at a certain point, maybe around 5th grade, someone got me in front of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And when I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I suddenly understood why people said reading could be fun. There was something about the huge imagination of that story and the idea of kids going on adventures and being heroes. And I just wanted that to come true so bad. And I remember I had grandparents, and I was over at my grandma's house, and my grandma was old and she had a big closet. So I was like, maybe. And I remember going into her closet, and I had to push through a bunch of coats, just like in the book, to get to the back of that closet. And at the rear of her closet, I'm not kidding, I found a tiny set of doors. And I was like, it's showtime. So I went in through those doors into a small storage room full of canned peaches. And it was an enormous disappointment, because I wanted to go into another world and fight bad guys and ride around on a lion and perhaps become king of that place. And instead, I found myself as Lord of the Canned Peaches. And it was my sad little domain, and I tried to make the best of it. But really, it was a big disappointment. And so here's what happened, though. Because I could not cross into another world like the children in Narnia, because I could not have that physically happen to me, I started doing it in my head. And at first, I would daydream about myself in Narnia. But then as time went on, I would daydream about other characters, and I would start inventing my own worlds and my own places. And because I couldn't cross into another world, I would do it in my mind. And it became sort of how I coped with reality and how I escaped from reality. And it became a safe, happy place I could go if I was bored in traffic or in the shower or on a road trip or in a class I didn't like. I could always escape into my mind. I had this world inside of me, or worlds inside of me, that I could build and excavate and make whatever I wanted to make them into. And there came a point in high school where I wanted to start sharing what I had seen. And so go ahead and move forward. Next slide. So my journey as a writer began as a daydreamer. It began with creating worlds in my mind and adventures in my mind and acting them out as a child. And then, I was at San Diego Comic-Con a few years ago, and I was listening to the Lord of the Rings people give a panel. I think it was probably like they were giving the panel for like the first Hobbit movie or something. And Peter Jackson was on stage, and someone in the audience asked him the question, how do you become Peter Jackson? How do you become the guy that made Lord of the Rings and knocked it out of the park? And he said, for me, basically, there was the things I was into when I was 17. I was into action movies and King Kong and fantasy. And he's like, and I just stayed into those same things. And that's how this happened. And my answer would be very similar. There were the things I was passionate about as a young boy and as a teen. And I really didn't know if I would ever be able to become a professional writer, but I did stay passionate about making up stories. And it's still what I do to cope with traffic, or to cope with boredom, or to cope with a busy day, or I still escape into my mind in stories. And many of those stories will never be shared because I don't have time to share them all. But there reached a point where I had these stories in my mind that seemed cooler than some of the books I read and cooler than some of the movies I saw. And I wanted to share them with people. And I remember when I tried writing them down, at first it was so frustrating because I could see the story really clearly in my mind. But when I looked at what I wrote on the page, I was like, am I a simpleton? Like, is this what's entertained me so much? But no, it's not true. Like, I just didn't know how to translate what I saw into written words yet. And I'm still not perfect at it. I'm still learning. But I learned that as I paid attention to how my favorite authors built their scenes, and as I practiced writing my own scenes, over time, I got closer and closer to being able to communicate the stories in my mind in written scenes. And it was about at age 30 that I reached a point where I was able to write in a publishable way, and I began publishing books, starting with Fablehaven Book 1. Go ahead and go to the next slide. A fair question that people ask fantasy writers all the time, that I get asked all the time, is where do my ideas come from? I've given you the broad answer already. The broad answer is my ideas come from a mix of observation and daydreaming. I pay attention to the world around me. I pay attention to the books I read, the movies I see, and the experiences I have, and the people I meet. And sometimes that evolves into characters or stories in my head. Let me give you a few examples. Go ahead and go to the next slide. My brother Bryson was a recklessly curious kid. He was the kind of kid who would get up to mischief over and over again pretty reliably. And if you see in that picture, he's wearing his camouflage shirt. He has a granola bar box dangling from his belt that is full of survival gear. And I modeled some of the details of Seth after my brother Bryson, because that was the kind of kid I wanted to portray. Seth isn't exactly like Bryson, but they share some similarities in reckless curiosity and in wanting to go on adventures as a kid. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So sometimes my characters are based on people I know. Sometimes people I know end up becoming like my characters, which is what happened with my son, Chase. It's like the kind of curse a mother gives you, like, I hope you have a kid who's just like you. Like Chase might have been that a little bit. Go ahead and go forward. I have my cousin Tanu. My cousin Tanu is half Samoan. And because I have a Samoan uncle and these Samoan cousins, I wanted to create a Samoan character in my book, which is Tanu, the potion master. I named the character after Tanu. I kind of modeled him after some of the things I saw in my my Samoan uncle and in some of the family members on his side, and to create this personality for Tanu. But I know my cousin Tanu was super mad when he saw the picture of Tanu in the book. Go to the next slide. It's like, Tanu, perhaps someday you can grow in to fill those shoes and to fill that shirt, but maybe not. But to me, it was really funny that when my cousin saw the illustrator, he was like, what? I mean, saw the illustration, it was like, what? Okay, go ahead and go forward. Sometimes characters in my books are not like people that I know, though I like to joke that Muriel the Witch is sort of like my mother-in-law, but that's purely like a cheap shot and a joke. Muriel the Witch had an origin not with a person. Muriel the Witch was one of the bad guys, or kind of the main bad guy in the first Fablehaven book. And she had her origins in, my sister was reading in a book that the word for witch in Arabic can be translated into one who blows on knots, or at least some word for witch in Arabic can be translated to one who blows on knots, according to this book. And to me, one who blows on knots was just a creepy description. It was just spooky in a way I couldn't fully put my finger on, but that kind of bothered my mind. And I was like, I have to find a way to tell children about this. And so I ended up, I only have a little more time left, but I ended up creating a witch at Fablehaven who was imprisoned by a knotted rope, who could never get free until she got every last knot untied. No matter how she tore or bit at those knots, she couldn't get free. And she became Muriel the Witch. I won't say too much about her in case you haven't read the book, and then you can find her secrets. Go ahead and page forward like a couple now, because I'm basically out of time. We'll have to skip a few slides. Imagination can take you places. I've gotten to travel the world, and that feeds my imagination. Keep rolling, just keep rolling forward. I've gone to Moscow, Russia, and Alaska, and Jakarta, Indonesia, and just keep going. And all those places have fed my imagination and given me things to write about. I went to China, and keep going forward. Let's just end with this slide because I got to end because I'm out of time. I had some more I could have shared, but that's how it goes. It was a joy for me to write the Fablehaven books, and I'm so excited about the Dragonwatch series. Partly because the Fablehaven books ended the story I started, but they kind of left the characters dangling. And with Dragonwatch, I was able to more deeply and fully explore the characters in a grander story. That I will prove that with 4 and 5. It's like the mightiest climax I think I've ever written. And it will, whereas Fablehaven tells the full story of Fablehaven, the story of Kendra and Seth will be more resolved and fully told by the end of Dragonwatch. To me, it's exciting to create a bunch of new adventures for some of my favorite characters. And thank you for your time and attention. It was nice to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Brandon. Next, we will be hearing from Scott. So whenever you're ready, Scott Savage, just take it away.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Actually, I can keep talking about Fablehaven for a while because I'm a huge Fablehaven fan, but I'll talk about my books for a little bit. So I've written several different middle grade fantasy series. I didn't start writing middle grade. I started writing adult mysteries and thrillers. And when I wrote my first middle grade fantasy series, everything just kind of clicked. I've been on some panels where I'm with middle grade and YA authors. And one of the things that we kind of discovered is that what you remember most as an author when you think about being younger, usually is what you end up writing. So for me, I wrote the Far World Fantasy series, the Case File 13 middle grade horror series, the Mysteries of Cove Steampunk Dragon series, and then my new series is the Lost Wonderland Diaries. And when you look at those at first, it's like, okay, so there's scary books and there's straight fantasy and there's Alice in Wonderland and there's steampunk and dragons and everything. Like, what ties those together? And for me, I think it's kids who don't fit in. And when I remember being younger, it was that time of not fitting in. When I was, I think in first grade, I was diagnosed with having a lazy left eye. They've got a more formal word for it now, but I had to have a patch over my good eye and I had glasses. So right away, it's like, okay, well, I'm a pirate. That's what I told people, I'm a pirate. And then I had trouble pronouncing certain words. And so I was in speech therapy regularly. I daydreamed a lot. My teachers come up to me and they'd be like, Scott, are you doing your work? And I'd look up and be like, what? You know, and so I really didn't fit in. And I remember when I was in fifth grade, we had a teacher, Mrs. Brazzoni, who had reading time. And she introduced us to, you know, a lot of the classics back then. A Wrinkle in Time and Charlotte's Web and Where the Red Fern Grows and The Little Prince. And that just really clicked for me. And later on, between 7th and 8th grade, our family moved from California, where I had grown up, to New Jersey, right between 7th and 8th grade, which is, God, one of the most awkward times, I think, for kids. And I was already kind of shy and quiet. And because I was from California, kids thought, well, okay, he thinks he's better than us. And so, man, I got picked on like crazy. I got eggs smashed on my head and rocks thrown at me and my bike stolen. And I needed a safe place to go. And where I went was the library. And that was just a lifesaver for me. I tell librarians that they are my superheroes because I really feel like they saved my life. And so when I write about stories, I write about kids like me. And I do a lot of school visits. And when I go to schools, I recognize those kids, the kids who are just like super excited to tell you about the story that they're writing or the book that they're reading. And it's like, yeah, that's me. And so that's kind of how I started out. Okay, next slide. So one of the big questions, obviously, is why write another Alice in Wonderland retelling? I think Wonderland itself really is a draw for retellings, but most of the time when you read them, it's like grown-up Alice who's now in a mental asylum, or YA Alice, that's a drug story or a battle story or whatever. For me, there are two reasons that I see that people write retellings. Either one is there's something that you didn't like about the story and you want to change it, whether it's a fairy tale or a fantasy or a classic. The other option is that you just love that world and you want to see more of it. And that was absolutely the case for me. Alice in Wonderland has always been a story that I've loved ever since I've read it. It's something that I just come back to over and over. And I think that the world really sort of pulls you in by this weird combination. So I always liked the idea of writing a story that was a middle grade story for kids where they go back and rediscover Wonderland. I'm going to go to the next slide there. So what I do a lot when I'm thinking about one story idea is I start to sort of research around it. And you have this one idea that you're hooked on, that you love, and then another idea comes. And when those two combine, kind of like the Venn diagram thing, that middle piece is like, oh, this is the story that I want to tell. So a lot of us know the Lewis Carroll that's known for his imagination and his creativity. And I mean, he created words like burble and mimsy and chortle and galump that he just created, and now we use them all the time. And I think that, like, other than the Bible and Shakespeare, Alice in Wonderland is the most quoted work of literature. And the thing that I love about this is he was writing for kids, which wasn't done a lot back then. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the things that he did as a writer. But he wrote a book that both adults and children could enjoy. And that's something that I get asked for a lot. When I do school visits or library visits, I have parents come to me and say, okay, I've got I've got a 10-year-old daughter who's reading at a much higher level. So I need stories that are challenging for her, but that are age appropriate for her as well. And I had an editor who called that smart fiction. And that's something that I love reading. I love seeing it in movies, you know, where you're like, okay, this movie, I'm enjoying it as an adult, but I see that my grandkids are enjoying it as well. And so I had that part, that side of Lewis Carroll. Okay, so next slide. Okay. There's another side, and that is that Lewis Carroll's real name is Charles Dodson. And Charles Dodson was a math professor. He specialized in geometry, linear and matrix algebra, mathematical logic. He wrote lots and lots of math books. He was an inventor. He invented an early version of Scrabble. He invented kind of his own version of Braille that he used because he wanted to write at night without having to burn a candle. So he created this nictograph that he used to actually write at night with no lights. He invented word ladders. He really wanted to make math fun, and he did lots of different things, math knots and different games and stuff where he had fun with math. And so go ahead and go to the next slide there. What I think worked for me from the very beginning when I was a kid in Alice in Wonderland is this combination of logic and imagination. Those two things connect in a way that I think honestly appeals to a lot of kids. I mean, right now with the pandemic and everything that we've got going on, you've got this one side of logic where it's like, okay, you know, you've got to wear a mask and you can't be around other kids, and you know, you've got to do this and you've got to do that, and here's all these rules that are the logic side. But then there's imagination side, and I've read so much about both kids and adults who are escaping into fiction and fantasy. And for me, fantasy was that. It was both an escape and an answer, because I could read books that were straight fantasy and were totally different, but I also read books about kids who were like me and connected. And I think that, again, when you look at Alice in Wonderland, it really is a coming of age story. And if you look at kids, you know, as they grow through the phases, you know, if you've got Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, and I know this sounds like a weird combination, but religion and politics, these are all a combination of logic and imagination. And what do you believe and what do you not believe? And how do you tie that all together? And so for me, all of this kind of clicked into both a world and a group of characters. So go ahead and go to the next slide. When I wrote Alice in Wonderland, I started with Celia and Tyrus. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about the characters as we go forward, but Celia is a girl with dyslexia, and her mother is a librarian. So right away, you've got this conflict of her really not liking books and her being around books all the time. Then you've got Tyrus, but as part of her learning how to read, as I interviewed and talked to people with dyslexia, I discovered that literally what they were doing when they were learning to read is they were memorizing the shape of words, okay? And so I have an example that I show when I do school visits that is showing what words look like for someone with dyslexia. And if you try to focus on the individual letters, you can't read it. But if you let your brain sort of like fuzz out just a little bit and look at the shapes, suddenly you can read those words. So because of what Celia has done, she really loves logic, and math is kind of her thing. Tyrus is a person who's been picked on his whole life. And like me, he went into the libraries and escaped there. And so he knows all the stories, all the imagination. When he talks about things and figures things out, he uses book analogies. He uses, you know, it's like the kid whose best friends and greatest stories all took place in books. That's me, and that's Tyrus. So the two of them meet in a library. They discover that Lewis Carroll kept diaries his whole life. And this was one of those other ideas that clicked for me in the research, is that he kept diaries, but after he died, 4 of his diaries disappeared, and no one knows what happened to them. And so it's like, okay, what are really in those diaries? So they find the diaries. They discover that Charles Dodson, the mathematician, figured out how to open a doorway to another world. Okay, go ahead and click on the next slide. So then writing this story again, knowing that I'm focusing on kids who want to read some art fiction, I'm focusing on this logic and imagination side. We start with a new place in Wonderland called the Arithmecy. And this was something I added based on the idea that when Alice gets there, she cries and she creates this ocean. But the Arithmecy is filled with swimming numbers that form math problems. In the entire book, we have these problems and puzzles, just like we had in Alice in Wonderland. So at first, Celia's great. She solves the math problems, and so they're getting away from the crocodile who wants to eat them. But then the problems start to go from straight math to sort of more imaginary, okay? Like think like algebra, but with weird creatures and stuff. And now it's up to Tyrus with his imagination to look at the world in a different way. So he literally has her turn him upside down to look at the problem in a new way. Okay, next slide. Then they get to the Duchess, okay? And if you've ever read Alice in Wonderland, you know that at first the Duchess is really nasty and mean, but later on she helps Alice, and it's like, why did that happen? What's going on here? So if you've ever heard someone say, oh, you've got to get on their good side, she has a literal good side. So again, we've got these puzzles they're figuring out. Next slide. And we wanted to add a new kind of a guide for them in Wonderland. So I took the great grandniece of the White Rabbit, Sylvan. Well, the rabbits have actually summoned Celia and Tyrus there, thinking that they're calling the Alice. And so this is another puzzle. Why did the clock say that the Alice is going to save the world? Why did Charles Dodson write about Alice in Wonderland when neither of them are named Alice? Okay, next slide. They go in search of course, my favorite character, the Mad Hatter. But unfortunately, the Mad Hatter can't help them right now because he has been trapped in time. And in order to help him get out of time, there's another word puzzle they have to figure out. This time they discover that all of his dialogue forms a chiasma. The first thing he says to them is the same thing as the last thing. The second is the second to the last. Anyhow, another puzzle they have to figure out. Okay, next slide. So they get captured by the Queen of Hearts. Now this may not look like the Queen of Hearts that you're as familiar with, but when I looked again at Wonderland and I went, okay, it really is this logic and imagination. The Queen of Hearts is the ultimate logic, okay? If you can't help her, she's gonna cut off your head. I don't need you. Her husband is the imagination side, the King of Hearts, who's going around pardoning everybody. And so when you look at the world and Celia and Tyrus and the original Alice in Wonderland, it still comes back to those puzzles of logic and imagination. Okay, next slide. So one of the great things that Lewis Carroll did as an author, again, he wrote really what I consider the first middle grade novel, but he also introduced a young girl as the narrator of Alice in Wonderland, which was completely groundbreaking at the time. You could have a young girl in a story, but never a young girl telling the story. And again, in this coming of age story, we see Wonderland through this really unique view of Alice. So when I went with my narrators, go ahead and jump to the next slide there. There we go. I wanted to have narrators that were a little different. So number one, I went with a dyslexic girl. And again, going back to the focus that I don't know that I intentionally did it. I didn't realize it until later, but I always write about kids who don't fit into their world. And we have some good stories about dyslexic kids, but a lot of times stories about kids who don't necessarily fit in are focused on that thing. So it is a story about dyslexia, or it is a story about autism, or it is a story about a child with a disability. I didn't want that. I wanted this to be a story about a dyslexic girl who is solving problems and discovering that her neurodiverse brain is actually a great thing. So the two of them don't feel like they're the people who can save Wonderland, but ultimately they discover that their differences are what made them strong. And then you've got Celia being dyslexic, having a librarian for a mother. So, you know, she describes it as someone who's terrified of swimming, who lives in a swimming pool. And then Tyrus, that's the, you know, when I describe me, the kid who gets picked on and goes to the library, he loves fantasy. He gets pulled in there. So between the two of them, you've got puzzles and problem solving, and the two of them learning how to balance their imagination and logic to work together. And ultimately, it is their coming of age story and discovering that being dyslexic or loving books isn't something to hide, it's something to celebrate. And I had to work really hard on that. I had to interview a lot of people with dyslexia, and I had a lot of readings where dyslexic families would say, okay, you got this right, but this isn't right. This isn't, you know, it's not us trying to solve our dyslexia. It's being dyslexia as a part of it and celebrating that's who we are. Okay, next slide. So, great. We've got this whole Wonderland story. We've got the characters. We've got logic. We've got imagination. We've got the puzzles. Kind of one of the last pieces that I had to put together was to figure out who is going to be reading this book. And as I started to talk to people about Wonderland, I discovered that I had 3 unique groups of readers. And I think that's going to be the case in bookstores, libraries, I mean, households even. It's really funny. I've gotten reviews where people say, I had to read this because I love Wonderland. And I have people say, I hate Alice in Wonderland. Like, that story really bugs me. But when I read this, it opened it up for me in a new way. So I felt like I had 3 groups of readers that we were going to be focusing on. The first group, and this could be a lot of our younger middle grade readers, are people who are not familiar with Wonderland at all. So for them, I wanted that straight fantasy adventure story, like Brandon talked about, you know, going through those doors and this portal and discovering this new world. And so for them, you know, they may not know who the Hatter is or who the Duchess is or who Cheshire Cat is, but they will discover them as they go. And so kids do not have to be familiar with Alice in Wonderland at all to jump in and read this as a straight fantasy story. Then probably my biggest group of readers is people who have seen the movies. And that's great because they know a lot of the characters. You know, they know who Cheshire Cat is. They know who the Queen of Hearts is. But they also think that Tweedledee and Tweedledum and the Cheshire Cat and the Hatter and the Jabberwock are all in one world, because movies tend to combine those. So for them, what I wanted to do was be able to have a book where they go, oh yeah, look, that's the Dodo, and that's the Queen of Hearts, and that's the Duchess and everything. But it's in a different world, because in the 150 years since Lewis Carroll went to Wonderland, something has entered the world that is turning the creatures into monsters. And so the White Rabbit is actually this terrifying creature that has this focus on gathering clocks and everything. And Marianne, his servant, is Marianne, this terrifying marionette. The Cheshire Cat is mechanical. The Hatter has been stuck in a tea party for 150 years. Then my final group is the people who really know Wonderland. And I wanted to drop a lot of Easter eggs in for them that, again, hopefully it's not going to take away from the story if you don't get them. But if you know and love Wonderland, then you're the person who will go, oh, I get why he put the 2 faces on the Duchess and why she keeps talking about the moral of that is this and the moral of that is that, because they've read the story enough to recognize these things. So hopefully this book will appeal to all 3 readers. Okay, next slide. So I think when you look at sort of the themes of the book, and as authors, we're not trying to put in themes. It's like, I'm not trying to teach something. I'm just writing a story. And then afterwards, you kind of look at it. And it's when we do these school visits and these author visits that we learn about the themes, because we hear kids talking about their takeaways. And so far, some of the takeaways that I've seen are looking at the world in a new way, self-acceptance, realizing that our differences make us great, a big focus on neurodiversity. I love just in the the month or so of virtual school visits that I've been doing, getting emails from parents of kids with dyslexia going, my daughter was so excited to, you know, hear about this book and to realize that a neurodiverse character was the hero. And so that's just great. I love that. And also kids who don't really know, or adults who don't know what dyslexia is, discovering that it's not just a couple of mixed up words, and empowerment and working together and logic versus imagination. Okay, last slide. And so if you want to get an e-arc, we're gonna turn it over to Ilise here in just a minute, but you can go to my website, www.jscottsavage.com. And if you click on the section for educators and bookstores and librarians, I've got videos for kids, educational writing videos. I've got the links to NetGalley and Edelweiss. I've got some really great videos about what dyslexia is, and just a bunch of fun stuff on there. So if you want to request an author visit or an ARC, you can jump to the website there, and then Ilise will also give you information. So anyhow, this was great. Ilise, I am going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. And I see we're running a bit short on time. Excuse me. So I'm going to quickly move through these. Moderator, let's go to Q&A in just a minute or two, because I see there's a lot of questions that are queued up. There are several companion books to the Dragonwatch and Fablehaven universe. Coming up next year is the origin story of Dragonwatch, Legend of the Dragon Slayer. 50 illustrations, one on every spread. This is the never before published story of Dragonwatch, including insights from Brandon Mull. And it'll have secrets to the finale of Dragonwatch, book 5, which is coming in 2022. Next slide. These are two great backlist fantasy series for middle grade. Mysteries of Cove is by J. Scott Savage. It's a steampunk plus dragon series. And Wizard for Hire by Obert Sky puts a wizard in modern day America. Next slide. Champion's Quest is coming out next year. This is an RPG, role-playing game fantasy like Dungeons and Dragons. It's about two kids who see a shop. It's called Hob and Bogey's Curiosity Shop. And in the window, they see dragons and miniature warriors and monsters, and it proves too tempting for them. So the kids go ahead inside the store, and what they find is they are thrust into the Champion's Quest game itself. And I wanted to point out that the characters represent racially diverse kids and kids with a wide range of life experiences. So two of the boys are foster kids who are in a group home, and one of the girls is new in town and is the target of bullies. Next slide. Go past this one. Next. I'll send you an email after this is over with information about these other empathy building titles. And I'll also be in a Booklist middle grade webinar at the end of the month, and I'll be talking about these titles. Next. 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 Some of these empathy titles, the backlist, I've reactivated on Edelweiss, so you can go ahead into that catalog and request EARCs in case you missed these. Next. Ming's Christmas Wish is a wonderful story, and I'll mention it because we're close to the holidays. Ming is a girl who doesn't quite feel like she belongs either in her American culture or her Chinese culture at home, but she has two wishes. One, she longs to sing in the school Christmas choir, but every year her teacher says no, and it's understood it's because she's Chinese. And two, she wants a big, sparkly Christmas tree, like the one she sees in the department store window. But Mama is traditional Chinese, and she will not hear of it. Next slide. So Pops takes her to see an old family friend whose house is filled with beautiful symbols of Chinese culture. And then he takes her to a small altar at the base of a sequoia created by Chinese miners decades ago. And Pops says to Ming, I was 14 when I came from China. I worked with my father in San Francisco. When there was trouble, he brought me to this mountain. Here, he said, we are not foreigners. Here we are men, a small part of nature's greatness. And here Ming realizes that all cultures have cherished symbols worth celebrating. And then finally, She Stood for Freedom is a story of a white Southern teenager who found herself on the front lines of the civil rights movement. The picture book is told using beautiful collage artwork, which conveys the turmoil of the 1960s. And then the middle grade edition, which you see at the top, also has primary source documents from Joan's own collection. And there is also a reader's guide, which you can download from Edelweiss. Next. Next slide. I think we go right to Q&A. I know you have a lot of great questions for our authors, so let me throw it back to Julia for that section.
All right, thank you so much, and we can welcome both our authors back here. We have gotten a number of questions from our attendees, so I am just going to get this going, and if you all have any other questions, feel free to keep typing them in. We'll go as long as we can. So one of the first ones we got said, has being in lockdown for COVID lessened your ability to get cool ideas for writing?
I think for me personally, so the lockdown didn't change a lot. Like Brandon said, we spend a lot of time just kind of in our office imagining. For me, the thing that may have had the biggest impact is the Black Lives Movement, the Own Voices movement. Like that really has made me completely look at what I'm writing, who I'm writing it to, and encouraging students to tell their own stories in that way. So for me, you know, as sort of an outsider, you know, a white male looking at this and re-examining who I am and what I'm doing, that's probably had a bigger impact on me than being locked in my office.
For me, it's been, it's been, I told you I got a remarriage, right? and so getting married in the middle of COVID and trying to blend 7 kids with 4 kids has just been like an emotional stew pot, right? And so like if part of writing is having some raw emotional material to draw from, I'm swimming in raw emotional material, maybe more than I would have ever signed up for. But like, it's wonderful, but there, yeah. So there's a lot going on in my head, in my house, in my life, even though I'm kind of locked away from, you know, some activities I used to be able to do. And that feeds the stories, right? I mean, I'm writing about secret wildlife parks for magical creatures. And so a huge part of this has to live in my head anyway, and my head is still accessible, right?
Definitely. Let's see, another question we got was, do you feel that fantasy helps young readers tap into the idea that they can change the world?
I mean, I think one of the most beautiful things about fantasy is it encourages the mind to think about what might be possible. You know, as we're able to reconcile and believe a story that basically has some impossible elements, it stretches our mind to seeing what might be possible. This includes often the idea that a kid can be a hero in ways that exceed what we normally see in real life. In all my stories, I basically have young main characters, and they're achieving things that any adult would be so proud of. And so I think by modeling that, we're one of the nice consequences of that is we plant ideas that, yeah, a kid can be a hero, you can be a hero.
And I think that's really like someone, I've had adults say to me, well, middle grade authors, like you have kids doing things that kids that age could never do. And first of all, I would argue that because kids that age have done some amazing things. But I think part of what we write is what kids imagine they would do and what they would want to do and how they view it, you know? And so I totally agree with everything Brandon said on that.
Very good. This is going to be kind of in the same vein, but I think different enough where kind of the idea of the hero's journey and how that is central to fantasy. And, you know, they're going off and doing all these amazing things during their quest and, you know, have these obstacles in the physical world that they need to overcome. But the story like truly reflects more of like an inner journey. And what does that mean to you guys?
So I think that as writers, we have inner conflict and external conflict. So the external conflict is I've got to fight ogres or dragons or you know, the evil Queen of Hearts or whatever. But the bigger obstacles, I think, in most stories is what the characters believe, you know, where their limits are there, who they trust that they can't trust, what their secret is, what, you know, how they feel about themselves and that sort of thing. And I think that that is something that kids are dealing with 100% of the time, you know? I mean, every day when you go to school and there are kids watching you and judging you and what do I show and what do I hide? And especially during the pandemic, I think that's been even more so. So yeah, I think absolutely that fantasy stories do mirror the conflicts that kids have in their real lives and help them to go, yeah, I can do that.
I also like to look, a thing that maybe I've repeatedly looked at in some of my books is what does being a hero do to the character? Like what marks are left or what scars are left. Like my Beyonder series is almost all about that. But also in Dragonwatch, you know, the character Seth has gotten help from some dark sources that have given him great power at times. But also, like, if I was being honest with my storytelling, it would leave a taint. It would leave something that good heart would have a hard time reconciling. And so Dragonwatch for me is largely a story of redemption and how you could maybe do hard things as a hero and also maybe find redemption for yourself from some of the hard or tough things you've had to do along the road. That's really complicated and actually kind of ambitious, but like I'm trying to do a really sincere redemption story. And I think partly because I think every human heart needs redemption stories. Like, cause we all hit points where we realize, oh, in this way I'm kind of broken, or in this way I'm kind of scarred. And we all have this hope that, oh, maybe I can feel whole again. And I think there's something beautiful about seeing that modeled in a story a little bit, you know?
For sure. You both mentioned sort of classics in the fantasy world that have inspired you. Are there others that are just among your favorites, or like of more modern ones? Like what series or individual books are you loving right now?
I got a whole stack of stuff. I've been reading, so The Book Wanderers, I just grabbed a few of these off my nightstand. The Elephant Girl, about a girl who gets blown into a zoo. Wings of Fire is awesome. The Mystery of Black Hollow Lane. And I'm reading a lot of graphic novels too. A friend of mine, Dustin Henson, who actually is a dyslexic author, wrote a story, A Video Game Ate My Homework. So I think graphic novels are really, like, we had them as comic books when we were kids, but I look at those now and go, man, I wish some of these came out when I was that age, because I love those as well.
Yeah, and I was hit so hard. I mean, Harry Potter left an indelible mark on me. I know that's so obvious, but I'm not sure if anyone loves it as hard as I do. People might know the minutia better than I do, but I loved it so hard. Like it's why I write in this category. So I mean, that was a story where the kind of story where it's so smart and with such a rich world, like that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to build a story that a kid and adult could both like, and a story world that's kind of at that, trying to approach that level of quality. Like the most recent book I just read was Watership Down. So I guess maybe I do like old stuff, but like I reread Watership Down, and that was so like such a delight. It was better than I remembered, and I remembered it really good, and I really loved. So that's a book I just read that I love.
That's great. Would you say that you read a lot of middle grade sort of as part of your writing process or research process, or are you just like reading it because you love it and that's what you're writing to?
For me, I'm all over the place with what I read, and I don't read super high volume. I'm not a speedy reader. I've read a lot of books over time, but it's never like 10 in a week. You know what I mean? Like I'm not that kind of reader. But like I read middle grade. I love middle grade. I think it's great. I think Scott's writing great stuff, and like I love the category. But part of what I think a useful thing as a middle grade author is to read really broad in other categories and bring some of what I'm seeing into the category. I just kind of try to read the books that most call to me, which includes from like Jim Butcher to, like I said, just Watership Down to like, like plenty of adult stuff, but like fantasy has always had the special sauce for me. So I'm probably fantasy heavy, if anything.
And I think that, when I was younger, you wouldn't have seen an adult. First of all, there wasn't a lot of middle grade novels. Harry Potter really, again, kind of like Twilight did what that did for YA. Harry Potter really did that for middle grade. But I think now it's become okay. I did a signing back before when we could do signings, where I actually had a family with 4 generations that were there that were all reading my series. And it was so funny because I said, okay, so who introduced the series? Like, who was the one that discovered it and handed it to everyone else? And it was the oldest, it was the great grandmother who discovered it. And I guess we had the great grandmother, the grandmother, the mom, the kids, so these 4 generations, she was the one who started it. So I love the fact that it's okay now to read middle grade and YA as an adult, and that they're a big part of our audience.
Yeah, adults use it as clean adventure stories. So often I hear that, like, hey, it's clean, it's imaginative, it's just like a great, light, fun read. I hear that like, over and over.
Yeah. Let me look at the clock here. I think we may only have time for about one more. But let's say an element of fantasy is fear and danger, and sometimes even lives are at risk. So how do you think educators can use this genre to help kids ease the stress of living through the pandemic, or seeing a loved one suffer maybe from the virus, or just some other big issue in their world?
I mean, I think anytime we see characters being brave through hard things, it almost gives us permission to be brave through hard things. I think for me, myself, I learned more about courage from Frodo and Lord of the Rings than any other book I ever read, because I saw someone small being brave against big things. And that really drew me in. And I really saw, bravery it isn't about being like awesome and fully equipped to deal with the trouble. It's about doing your best anyway, even though you're not, And so like, for me, I read for danger, I read for thrills, I read for excitement. And I also think that can model courage, in cool ways sometimes.
I love when I get these reviews where they say, okay, you got to be aware there's actually a scary scene, or there's scary scenes in this book. And it's like, as a kid, I loved scary stuff. And I like the quote that says that fantasy isn't telling kids that dragons are real. It's showing them that they can defeat dragons. And I think that kids already know that scary stuff is real. They have a lot of sometimes even overwhelming stuff. And so seeing kids face hard things and deal with that just repeats that message that kids can do hard things, and they really can. Sometimes kids can handle hard things better than adults can. So
if the most sensitive kid in the world wasn't too scared by my books, I would have felt like I'd missed the mark. Like, because I was trying to write for a kid like me that would have gotten a little bored if it wasn't kind of scary. You know what I mean?
Agreed.
Yes. Well, I think that's it for our Q&A. Thank you so much for answering all these questions. I'm just going to do
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. I'm going to wrap up here. So tomorrow, all attendees will receive an email containing links to today's slide presentation, title list, certificate of completion, and video recording. For more about Booklist webinars, be sure to visit booklistonline.com/webinars, where you can view archives of past webinars and register for upcoming ones, like those you see here. If you haven't already, be sure to check out the Booklist Reader, where Booklist contributors post daily about all things books and library land. Not yet a subscriber? Pair the page-by-page reading experience of print with the convenience of online access at booklistonline.com and lock in print, online, digital, and archive access by taking advantage of this special webinar offer to get Booklist for only $75. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, and one more big thanks to our sponsor, Shadow Mountain. This concludes today's webinar.